Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Chris Provines. Chris is founder and CEO of Vantage Partners and is an accomplished executive, business advisor, and adjunct professor with broad global experience in Fortune 500 businesses. His experience includes vice president roles at Johnson & Johnson and Siemens in commercial excellence, strategic pricing, account management, global procurement, and business improvement. As an advisor, he helps businesses grow profits through smarter pricing and commercial execution. He is an author of 3 books. Chris has trained over 8,500 sales and marketing professionals in value-based pricing, selling value, and negotiating with 21st century procurement. So with that, Chris, welcome.
Great, thanks Taylor, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from, and welcome to this session. Hope you enjoy it. This is a very broad topic, so we'll go deep into a couple of areas and then hopefully give you some insights to cover exactly what we've talked about, which is helping use value to engage professional buyers and close deals and speed up deals. So we'll try to accomplish these learning objectives today. First of all, I'll give you a little bit of a perspective of who are professional buyers and how they make decisions. We'll talk about how they think about value in terms of negotiations and their own negotiation strategy. Then we'll get into really going deep into the buying process itself or sourcing process and give you a perspective of how value fits into all 6 stages of the buyer's purchasing process. And then we'll talk about at the end, how do you turn professional buyers into advocates and use them to help leverage your value proposition, your company, and have them be an advocate for you in terms of spreading the good news into their organization. So let's get started. So there's Taylor did a quick introduction of me. The only other thing I'll point out on here is I have done training with thousands of salespeople, and the topic that we're going to cover today is something near and dear to me because I think it's very important. I've done in these sessions some basic training that includes trying to get salespeople to understand the customer's buying process, and it may or may not be surprising to you, but in my experience, I have not had one group of salespeople in 6 or 7 years and across 8,000 or so training personnel to actually have one salesperson be able to describe effectively what is the customer's buying process. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that today because I think that is one of the key points for using your values to actually understand what the customer is doing. Okay, so let's start with the big picture of why procurement matters. Obviously, if you're spending time, your valuable time on a webinar, you're probably doing it because either you in sales or your sales team, if you're in sales management, is having some difficulty or wants to get better at engaging procurement and professional buyers. And I'll step back and tell you why you've probably seen over the past 5 or 10 years your customers investing more in procurement and why it's become more important for your customers. So we'll give you a little bit of context of why procurement's getting more involved in buying decisions, why your customers are investing in better people and resources and process in procurement, and what's behind that all. Okay, so let's start there. So if you look across industries, and this is not a trend in one particular industry, but across industry, it's clear that there is a transformation in how organizations are going about attacking costs and about managing suppliers more strategically. So this is a mega trend that's out there that organizations have recognized that suppliers present a huge opportunity to A, work on the cost side, take costs out, but B, more importantly, bring value into their organization. So smart buyers recognize that I get more value by having a relationship with my suppliers and taking a more strategic approach to managing our suppliers. So there is a mega trend out there. Your customers are investing, regardless of what industry you're in, your customers are investing in procurement. Interesting statistics for you. I teach global procurement part-time at Rutgers University, and if you look across the universities in the United States, the number 1 or number 2 fastest growing majors in the business schools is actually supply chain and procurement. So that's just a sign that your customers are investing in procurement. The business schools in turn are investing in procurement. I know at Rutgers, I think we have around 1,100 students in the supply chain major. So it is a mega trend. So if today your sales team is struggling dealing with procurement, my message to you is it's not going to get any better. In fact, it's probably going to get worse. They're going to play a more important role in the future than they do today. They're going to have more power in the future than they do today. And they will become more sophisticated in the future than they are today. So it's a reality in sales that you have to be able to figure out how to engage this important stakeholder as you are selling and building deeper relationships with your customers. Okay. So what's driving this mega trend of organizations investing in procurement? It's really a few things. It's globalization. Of course, supply chains have become global. That's added an increased focus of pressure on suppliers and buyers. There's continued pressure on costs and growth in most organizations. Over the past decade or so, we've seen a growth in what I call outsourcing or solution sourcing, meaning your customers have outsourced more and more to their suppliers. That adds risk, that adds complexity in their business models, and it means suppliers are playing a more important role. You also have growing complexity and risk of supply markets. So as supplies move globally, as supply chains have lengthened, as supply chains have worked to take costs out and streamline things, that's added complexity and risk in supply markets. And you also have, which is always out there, these black swan events. So whether it's a hurricane or tornado or earthquakes or floods, there are events that occur that impact the supply chain. All of this means that companies have recognized that managing suppliers, managing my supplier-related costs, and becoming much better at purchasing or procurement is going to be one of the keys to success in the future. So this is why your customers are investing in procurement. Okay, so along with this, you see an evolution in the role of procurement, and we'll talk just a little bit about what this actually looks like. So in the old world of procurement, if you went and followed around a buyer and looked at what they were actually doing on a daily basis, here's the breakout of their time. So a lot of time on administrative issues, on quality issues or problems, expediting, and then a little bit of time on competitive bidding and negotiations. What's happened over time through technology, through better process, better practices, and better people, quite honestly, what procurement has been able to do is take all of that, what was traditionally a lot of administrative work, and really condense that. And now they've moved on to these new areas that you see. So working on cost reduction and planning, really getting in and working more tightly with suppliers on measurement and improvement, and working on more sophisticated and deeper supplier strategies, particularly supplier relationship strategies. And you can see on the right-hand side in blue what these look like. So you have outsourcing, new business models, new sourcing strategies like unbundling, other techniques to try to extract more value out of the supply base. Optimizing the supply base, all that really means is for many of your customers, if they've not done a great job of managing their suppliers, what they often do is have way too many suppliers. And so they go through a process of rationalizing and reducing suppliers and trying to do business with fewer suppliers, but have deeper relationships with those fewer suppliers. And we would call that supply base optimization. And at the bottom here, you see SRM, that's supplier relationship management. And so as your customers become smarter at managing suppliers and managing the supply base, there's always a recognition that I get more value as a buyer, not from negotiating another nickel off a widget, but by building deeper relationships with my suppliers and trying to get value beyond price from my suppliers. And so we'll talk a bit about that as we go. Okay, so again, this is a little bit of context building just so you can, as we get into how do you use value during the buying process, part of this is also understanding who's on the other side of the table negotiating from you or working with you, running the buying process, and what are they thinking about. So one last slide on context setting here. So this is what I call the characteristics of a 21st century procurement organization. So you're likely, if you're selling in B2B, you're likely to have customers who have a very wide range of procurement maturity, some that are not very mature at all, and some that are very, very mature. As they move to the very mature side of things, this is generally what that looks like. So first, a 21st century organization would have top management support. So they report into a CFO, a COO, or a chief executive officer. They're aligned with the business or organization. So that's a sign of a 21st century organization. Next is they have a clear operating model. And all that simply means is they have a way to organize themselves and purchase things and engage not only suppliers, but their own stakeholders in their business. And those could be different ways that they organize. Most leading organizations have something called category management, where they simply take everything they buy and organize that into categories and try to manage suppliers from a category perspective. The next characteristic of a 21st century procurement model is having a strategic orientation. So what you often see is your customers evolve from a very immature buyer to a much more mature buyer. Is they tend to be much more strategy driven, much more strategic, begin to focus beyond price, and they start to think of things such as total cost of ownership, the risk involved in making a supplier decision, focusing on innovation, how can I get innovation from suppliers and help grow my business. They will use more advanced cost savings and sourcing strategies, and they begin to move to managing the supplier network in a much more strategic fashion. And so it means fewer suppliers, it means deeper relationships, it means more tightly managing those suppliers and having scorecards and measurement and a whole host of other strategies and tactics. Along with that, they invest in their talent. So one of the signs for sales, if you work in sales and you've been engaging your customer for a long time, if you start to see new people come into procurement, and you start to see maybe more sophisticated people. In the past, maybe you dealt with people who are barely got out of college, and now you're dealing with people who might be MBAs or PhDs. That's usually a sign that your customer is investing in their procurement organization. So this is one of the keys for a 21st century organization. And then the last one, of course, is tools and technology. So if I go back to my days of working on the commercial side of the organization, we used to sell to customers, and often those customers, and they were fairly large customers, they couldn't actually tell us what they bought from us. That may sound crazy, but they would ask us to provide them a summary of what they spent on all the things we sell to them. I would say that that's largely in the past, and now they have, for the most part, fairly sophisticated tools. Most organizations are down the path of implementing procurement tools and technology that really do a couple things. Gives them clear visibility to exactly what they're spending and who they're spending it with. They have tools to manage and control spending and make the whole purchasing process more efficient. And you also have, in some industries, I work in healthcare primarily, in some industries, they have really deep transparency to what others are paying for the same supply items. So transparency is a big trend in procurement as well, and they have lots of tools to do this. Okay, so that's a little bit of context of who are these procurement people and where is it going? If your salespeople are struggling today, I would tell them get ready because it's only going to get worse. You're, by and large, you're going to have procurement people become more powerful, play a much bigger role in the buying decision. They very rarely are the decider, but they certainly do manage the process and are a gatekeeper and can be a key influencer in most purchases. So part of what I opened up with is this idea that if you're in sales, if you manage a sales team, if you're in pricing, working with sales, if you're in marketing, I can guarantee you if you took your sales team and you put them in a room and you asked them to please map out the customer's buying process, that they can probably get about 3/4 of the process correct, but there's always a few steps they miss. And it's really critical for your sales team to actually understand how the customer buys. I know that might sound crazy, but in my experience, I've not yet had one out of over 8,000 be able to accurately describe how the customer buys. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this because in order to use your value to close deals, you have to actually understand how the customer buys, right? So let's walk through this, and we'll go deeper into each of these sections. This is a very simple buying process, or I call it a sourcing process. Your customer likely uses a process just like this. They may have 5 steps or 8 steps, but essentially they will cover the 6 areas that I have listed here. I like to use 6 simply because it fits on the slide nicely. But let me walk through this and show this to you and describe in a little more detail what each of these are and how value relates to these and how closing deals relates to each of these, okay? So the first part of any buying process, of course, is someone in the customer's organization recognizes that there's a need, problem, or opportunity that a supplier can help with, right? So that's always the first step. The next step in any buying process is they analyze the opportunity, they analyze the supply market, they analyze their own spend, how much in their own requirements, and they also get clear on what do they actually need to buy, what are the specifications or requirements for whatever I am purchasing, whether that's a physical good, whether it's a piece of capital, equipment, whether it's a service, whether I'm outsourcing parts of my business. I, as a buyer, need to get clear on exactly what my requirements are. So that's step 2. Step 3 is I develop a sourcing strategy, and we'll go through more of what that is. That's essentially thinking about how many suppliers do I need? Should this be a single source, multi-source? How am I going to go about buying whatever this is? Am I going to do an RFP? Is this something I'm going to negotiate directly with? How is that going to work? The next step is I invite suppliers and evaluate their solutions. Step 5 is I select a supplier or suppliers and I negotiate terms. And then step 6 is I implement and manage the relationship, okay? So this is a very standard process. One of the things that you can do is if you have an upcoming sales meeting, whether you're in sales management or marketing or pricing is, get your sales team together and have them map the process and see if they can get all of these steps. In my experience, there's usually a couple of steps that are missed. Okay, so we're going to walk through each of these in a little more detail, and then we're going to connect it to value. The key here is usually for larger, more sophisticated customers, this isn't an opaque process. They will actually publish this on their websites. So you can go to some of your key customers and they will publish what their process is for engaging suppliers and sourcing things. So you can have your actual customer sourcing process up there, okay? So let's walk through these, some of these steps individually, and we'll talk about what this actually means. Before I get to that, I'll give you some statistics and insights. So this is what the buyer is trying to do along the way, right? So in the beginning, they're trying to get really clear on the opportunity and get clear on what their requirements are. In the middle, it's developing a sourcing and negotiation strategy. And at the end, it's about implementing that agreement and getting the most value I can. There are various statistics out here. Here is one that I like to use from the Challenger sales book that basically says, by the time the supplier formally reaches out and engages, or by the time the buyer formally reaches out and engages the suppliers, they have already made 60% of their buying decision, okay? So for someone that had worked in procurement and someone that teaches procurement. This is not an aha at all. This is what we teach procurement people to do. So in the very beginning, they're building up their strategy, they're getting the requirements clear, and then they reach out to suppliers. So obviously the key insight here from a sales perspective and from the perspective of using your value is, if you're not in this process early and using your value to help the customer, A, understand the problem better, B, understand the opportunity, and then in step 2, help the customer get really clear in defining requirements, you've missed a big opportunity, right? So the flip side of that is, think about it this way, is if it's your competition who are working early in steps 1 and 2 to shape the customer's understanding of the opportunity and the requirements, you've missed a huge opportunity, right? Because it's likely that if your competition is smart, they will try to get the requirements or specifications written for whatever they're trying to sell. Okay, so we'll talk about other insights as we go here, but if you have value calculators or total cost of ownership or ROI tools that you might be using to demonstrate or quantify your economic value, if you're not using that early, you've missed a big opportunity. Okay, there's some other insights that we'll talk about here. Here's some other research that was done that said, when do you want executive buyers, when do you get value from engaging your supplier sales representatives? And you can see, most of them say early in the process, right? And that's very clear. What is clear from the research I've done when you talk to executive buyers, particularly with items that are bigger purchases, what they say clearly is, listen, we're not always the expert in the stuff we're buying. The supplier is the expert. We expect our good suppliers to be able to work with us and actually help educate us on how to make a better decision. And so they really are, from a strategic standpoint, particularly with important supply items, more strategic supply items, they want you as the supplier to spend time educating them. And this is where your value comes in, right? Okay, so let's talk about using a little more specifics about each of these steps and using value to close deals. So the key point here is you got to use your value, and you should be using it throughout this buying process. But if I could only use this in one spot, I would use it in the very beginning in steps 1 and 2, because if this is a new RFP, request for proposal, or request for quotation, or the customer's embarked on thinking about a major investment in plant and equipment, or whatever it is, or outsourcing, or IT, whatever you're selling, it's your opportunity in the very beginning of this to help them understand the problem, to get clear on what the opportunity is, and then define those requirements. And I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective about what the requirements can look like. So this is steps 1 and 2, as I talked about. This is, as a buyer, what I'm doing. Ideally, I want to leave step 2 with my requirements locked down. What do I mean by that? I should have very specifically, what are my technical requirements? What am I looking for from a total cost of ownership perspective, or investment perspective, or a price point? What am I looking for service, for quality, for delivery, for all of those elements that I need to make sure I understand how my suppliers perform, okay? So here's an example of what this can look like. So this is a framework. It goes through these 6 or so categories. So as a buyer, what I would be doing at this step of the process would be trying to get clear, do I have any regulatory requirements that I need to have my suppliers meet? Are there items around assurance of supply? So this would be supply continuity. So this would be things like, what's the supply chain capabilities of my supplier? What's their financial viability? What's their capacity? What's their delivery capabilities? And I would be defining those at a very specific and measurable level. I'd be getting into quality. So what do I need from a quality perspective? What are those specific things? Service as well. What do I need around lead times, flexibility, account management, training and support, all of that stuff. Of course, cost is a big factor in here. And then innovation is often a category they look at. So I'd be looking at innovation and what exactly do I need here, okay? So whether it's new ideas, continuous improvement, co-marketing efforts, it could be a whole list of things. So it would be nice, one of the things I tell suppliers, it would be nice is if you took whatever you're selling and actually write out what you think the requirements should be. Obviously, if you were smart, you do this in a way that favors your solution, right? And it's not just writing it that way, but having proof points and some value propositions that hopefully are quantified to help prove why, you know, a particular lead time makes a difference, or whether a particular design specification makes a difference to the customer, right? It makes a difference financially. And as a buyer, what I would be doing at this stage is actually going through this and getting much more specific and looking at each of these from a which are absolutely must-haves and which are nice-to-haves, and which have certain thresholds I need to hit, right? So this is what happens in step 2. In steps 4 and 5, I then take those requirements that have been defined in step 2, which hopefully you as a supplier have used your value to educate them and define those requirements for them. And then I bring it into an evaluation process. So if I'm serious about buying, I would be going through the evaluation process based on the criteria I've already defined or my requirements. And I would also bring that into a supplier selection process. So here's another insight from a sales perspective. Again, get your salespeople in a room and ask them this simple question. How does your customer make the final decision? So take me through how they do that and see what your salespeople have to say. In my experience, while most salespeople have a general feel for how the customer is making the final decision at the end, the specifics aren't there, and it's the specifics that actually matter a lot. So I'll take you through what I mean by that and how that connects to your value proposition. So this is a process we've talked about in these steps 4 and 5. Basically what the buyer is trying to do is these 4 things. Is A, verify selection criteria, go through some pre-qualification. So I get into the funnel, the suppliers that I want to be evaluating. I invite the suppliers and evaluate their solutions, and then I go through a selection process, right? So that's what I'm up to as a buyer. When I talked about the buyer making a decision on a supplier, what they have to do is have an analytical and objective way to do that, right? And so there's 3 basic approaches. Almost every organization uses these, either each of these or in some combination. So one might be total cost of ownership, or some kind of return on investment analysis, right? The next would be what we call weighted scoring models, and this would be going through, and based on the criteria I've defined, I would go through and actually score each of the suppliers and go through basically a weighted scoring model to come up with which supplier I want to choose. And then the third would be some kind of mathematical model. I might be trying to optimize my total costs or something I might be going through, okay? So when I said in the beginning of this section, you test your salespeople, get your salespeople in a room and ask them a simple question. How exactly does the customer make the final decision? Do they vote? Do they use a tool? What are they actually doing? This is where the devil's in the details. So if you're not understanding exactly how they're making the decision, it's really hard for you to use your value, right? So if I knew the customer was going to make a decision purely based on total cost of ownership, how I communicate value to them and how I engage may be a little different than if they're using a weighted scoring model. I might approach those a little differently, right? And so this is where the devil's in the detail, is really trying to understand exactly how is the customer going to make the selection decision, and then which approach to using your value do you want to take. Okay, and then at the end of this process, is step number 6. So as a buyer, I've gone through, done all my analysis, defined requirements. And again, as a buyer, I'm not doing this by myself. I usually have a team, a sourcing team I'm working with, and with my team, which includes technical experts and others in the organization, we are defining requirements. We take it through a sourcing process. We evaluate the suppliers. We decide which suppliers we want. We negotiate with them. Negotiations, of course, is an important area where you want to be able to use your value, right? You want to have trades identified and be able to trade value with the supplier. But at the end of the day, you're going to make a decision, or the buyer is going to make a decision on exactly what supplier to go with, and they need to implement that and manage the relationship. And this is really another key area to use your value. In this case, what the buyer does is something called SRM, that's called Supplier Relationship Management, and Supplier Performance Management, which is basically the fact that buyers, smart buyers, recognize that signing a contract is not the end, it's actually the beginning, right? So as a buyer, I get zero value from actually signing a contract. I only get value when I actually are able to implement that. And smart buyers realize that it's not just the price part of the equation that I get value if I've negotiated a better deal and reduced the number of suppliers, as an example. I actually get value if I smartly manage my supplier and look for ways that we can work together to take costs out and bring value in. Okay, so that's what supplier relationship management is all about. So this is how procurement creates value. So in the beginning, as I said before, it's all of the steps up through 5. That's signing a contract that creates no value. Once the contract is signed, it's really where you get value from your supplier. It's doing all of these things here, right? So part of what you have to do as a supplier is understand this is going to happen and how do I use this to my advantage. So as I said before, smart buyers recognize that there is more value created by working with fewer suppliers and having deeper relationships with those suppliers. And it's about moving along this continuum from a transactional relationship where we're just buying and selling to moving up to more of a collaborative relationship, okay? So this has been proven out time and again. I can tell you from a professional buying standpoint, the bias is to have fewer but suppliers but deeper relationships. There's lots of research that as buyers and sellers come together and build deeper relationships, that there is more value created. I could go through 2 hours of studies that we could go through together. But this is where the 21st century buyers are going to. Of course, they can't have a collaborative relationship with 10,000 suppliers, right? So they have to make a choice of which suppliers do I need to have what kind of relationship with. And again, this is an opportunity for you with your value proposition to help them understand why you should be one of the key suppliers. Part of it will depend on what you're selling. Part of it will depend on how you engage in that conversation. So to give you a little bit of context, this is a way to think about suppliers and relationships from a buyer side. So as a buyer, I can't have a strategic relationship with everyone. So the majority of suppliers, depending on what they're selling me, I would be pushing them down into more of a transactional relationship. Where there's engagement, there's respect, but I'm not investing in the relationship. There's not time and energy invested here. We're not working on lots of things together. It's really basically a minimal amount of engagement there because I just don't have time to do it. In the middle here is a group of important suppliers where I need to manage and measure a relationship. The relationship matters. It may not be a top-to-top relationship, but at some level of the organization as a buyer, I need to have a relationship. We need to have relationships. We need to measure the relationship. We need to manage it. I need to be focused on getting more value. And then at the very, very top is what we would have as strategic suppliers. And again, this will depend on the size of your customer and how many suppliers they have, how many suppliers they put in each of these buckets. But the very top you'd have where you have really tight relationships, super long term, you may be investing in each other. It's usually top to top relationships. You would have something called a nominated owner. And again, how do you move up this continuum here? One is it depends on what you sell. So if you were selling me copy or paper as opposed to something super critical to my operation, that makes a difference, obviously. But it's also how you engage as a supplier, right? How prepared are you to engage me in value conversations and helping us collaborate together? And I think from a buyer standpoint, you as a supplier, your ability to collaborate in part depends on a real deep understanding of what it is you're supplying and what is the value of that. What does that value actually mean to me, right? And what's happening in the future to that supply item? How can we work differently? How can we work on different business models together? That is what determines, in part, where you end up on this slide, okay? And of course, that depends on whether or not you have a clear value proposition. Okay, sorry, I jumped ahead a couple. Okay. So to kind of wrap this up and bring some of these together, I think what's really critical here is that your sales team has to be clear on what is your customer's buying process. So one simple thing you can do is get your sales team together and actually map the buying process. What I've seen in practice is a lot of sales teams have their own selling process, and they go through prospect and get people above the funnel, in the funnel, all the rest. All of that is nice and interesting, but if it's disconnected from the customer's buying process, you've missed a big opportunity. So make sure your team is really clear on the customer's buying process and when to use value. Value can be used throughout the buying process, but it's going to depend on where you are in that process. The next is start early. So if you wait until the RFP is issued, or if you're sitting here, if you're in sales and you get an RFP at noon today from a customer and it's due by the end of the week, first question you have to ask yourself is, A, is this a real opportunity or not? If you're on the outside, if you're an incumbent supplier, is this really a great opportunity or not? But B, also, if that comes in your mailbox, why haven't you been involved all along? What's happening behind that request for proposal, right? Next key insight from all this is you need to be in early shaping their requirements and specifications. If you allow your competition to do it, your competition is probably very smart. They will get the requirements and specifications written more towards their, whatever they're selling, their solution. So if you're not in there helping educate the customer on what it is you're selling and why the requirements need to be written in a certain way and why maybe lead times are important, your delivery, your service, why is that all important? That's critical. I worked with one supplier as an example, and they had a much bigger service footprint than their competition, and they were communicating in part to the customers that we have X number of people in the service organization, the competition has Y. And that's interesting, but it doesn't connect the dots for the customer. What that should be translated into, because of our investment in our service infrastructure, you're going to have less downtime, we're going to get you up and running quicker, your costs are going to be less. Whatever it is, you need to translate that for them. So again, using that example, I should be using that very early in the buying process to educate the customer so that they say, I need to understand what is the service footprint for this type of capital. Where are the service people located? What is their response time? What's their access to spare parts, as an example? How quickly can they get me up and running? So that's an example of if you could translate your feature or benefit, which is a better service organization, to what does it mean to the customer, and have the customer put that into their requirements. And when they go through the supplier selection process, you have a great opportunity. And the biggest insight, one of the other big insights from this is the last bullet here, which is don't forget closing the deal is just the beginning. So if you are the incumbent supplier and you're not having business reviews, you're not spending time educating the customer on the value that you're delivering on an ongoing basis, you've missed a huge opportunity. So Remember, closing the deal is just the beginning. You need to start there and begin to build deeper relationships. And by building those deeper relationships and educating the customer on the value that you've been delivering, you create what we call in the buying world switching costs, right? So you're able to raise your switching costs. So as a buyer, the next RFP cycle comes around, and if you've been doing that really successfully, you've made it really hard for me and my organization to switch from you, right? So what I see in practice sometimes is suppliers win the deal, they ink it, they start shipping, and they move on, and they wait till 3 months before the next RFP cycle, and they try to engage the customer then. And if you do that, you've missed a huge opportunity, right? Because if I'm the buyer and I'm in the middle of the RFP cycle, I don't want to hear about the great things you did for me 2 years ago, right? That's kind of lost on me. I'm into the game of RFPs and negotiations. So use your value early, use it often. Don't forget, closing a deal is just the beginning. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it back over to Taylor.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Great presentation. So we have had a couple questions come in during the webinar, but there are still time to enter your question into the panel on your screen. While you're entering, a reminder to complete the 10-second survey while exiting today's webinar to be entered into a raffle for one free copy of Chris's Selling to Procurement. Now to give you a couple more minutes to enter your questions, just a few words on Leverage Point. Sales Benchmark Index states that over 60% of forecasted deals do nothing. Forrester Research makes sense of this statistic with these next two quotes. They state the first vendor to succeed in communicating a vision of value to executives wins the business 74% of the time. And only 22% of executives feel that salespeople understand their issues and where they can help, showing that customer value communication and selling are closely tied to closing deals. Leverage Point tackles this difficult landscape with a SaaS solution that allow internal teams to collaborate around creating, communicating, and capturing value. In the creation side of Leverage Point, product, marketing, and pricing team members build value equations, models, and messages. They publish that value proposition, including the corporate branding and messaging, into a cloud-based library. The value proposition is accessible using custom filters by every rep at your organization to leverage and customize for every single customer call. One approved value proposition can turn into infinite unique value propositions. Value strategies support effective and efficient decision-making through product development. In the early stages, product direction can be supported with customer-centric R&D decisions to reduce cost and development time. Value strategies improve pricing and offer design to increase margins, and organizations utilizing value can rapidly ramp product revenues and achieve revenue objectives. After product development, the eyes are on the sales team to effectively communicate the published value proposition to customers and prospects. The best way to drive deals and quickly qualify prospects is to digitally transform a generic case study into a specific buyer business case through effective customer conversations. Sales reps can start quickly by embedding baseline data from a case study into Leverage Point and change numbers in real time during customer conversations in order to create a unique business case to buy that the prospect can leverage internally to drive the deal forward. For account executives and sales reps, value propositions are useful early in the sales cycle as flexible case studies in call preparation, in building sales confidence, in qualifying opportunities, and in engaging customer executives. For technical sales and pre-sales professionals joining the team in the middle of the sales process, value propositions provide customer value analyses as an important consultative selling tool to address pre-sales challenges. As customers decide to purchase, the value proposition becomes a shared business case to buy, collaboratively agreed between sales executives and customer sponsors that serves as a buyer's internal financial justification to purchase and the sales team's asset in a price negotiation. Value propositions in Leverage Point can be linked directly to an opportunity in Salesforce, downloaded to PDF or PowerPoint at any time for a personalized leave behind. On average, our clients achieve 5 to 15% higher closure rates and 5 to 25% higher prices. If you found any of that interesting, we'd love to have you enter into a raffle we do every month during these webinars to digitally transform one of your case studies free of charge. Just check the corresponding box in the exit survey upon leaving today's webinar or email us at casestudies@leveragepoint.com. All right, that is it from me. Okay, we've had a couple more questions come in, Chris. First and foremost, yes, this webinar is recorded, and the slides and recording will be emailed to you within 2 business days. All right, Chris, you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's get started there.
Okay, cool. So first question for you. Getting our sales team to do absolutely anything new is really hard. So how do we make this easy? Where do we start?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'd like to know who that business is, but anyhow, it's a good question. So part of this is what's obviously anything like this, what's in it for them? And if they're losing business or if they feel like they're wasting time, I think part of what this is in for them is be able to spend less time on deals that don't matter. Part of that comes down to understanding customer buying process and exactly what's going on. And B, obviously you want to close more deals because their compensation is hopefully tied to closing more deals. So I would get started really simply with helping them understand, first of all, the customer's buying process. And then secondly, where they might engage differently and where are there situations where maybe they shouldn't be responding to RFPs or requests for quotations, and use that free time to spend more time with their family, right? So there's a what's in it for them in either case, either be able to close more deals or waste less time and maybe spend some additional family time.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of self-motivation, I'm sure, sales reps. Okay, next one for you. How does our value communication have to change throughout the various steps of the buying process as we run into different stakeholders with varying priorities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we didn't have time to get into the super depths of this with our limited time today this morning, but you will have to take your value proposition and first of all, customize it to different stakeholders. So as a procurement person, I might be interested in certain things that maybe, our department head is less interested in. And there may be things the department head is really interested in that I am less interested in as a procurement person. So I think you need to be able to somewhat customize your value proposition to the audience, obviously. You want to be able to tailor it to who you're talking to and what really matters to them. And in terms of the process itself, I think Taylor had it on one of her slides, which is early on, I think you want to show them the possibilities and educate them on what it could be. And as you move further along, you've got to get to some very specifics about what it means to them, to their organization. So as I've been doing this for a lot of years and I've interviewed lots of customers about what has worked for them and what hasn't. When I mean customers, not suppliers, but people on the other side, so executive buyers. What do they think suppliers did things really well and those who didn't do things really well is they quickly got from kind of the concept and the vision, and I think, Taylor, you had this on one of your slides in the very early part of this, getting people aligned on a general vision of what this, what you're selling and what it could mean for their organization, and then very quickly get that to that organization's own numbers. So what does it mean to their cash flow, their balance sheet, their financial statements in general? What are you going to do for them to help them compete differently? So there's a strategic element of value too you can touch on here, obviously. And then as you go along, I think asking some questions in the beginning is really important to help guide your customization, your value proposition. So the one question I talked about at the end of my talk was, how will they actually make the decision? So do they vote? Do they use a weighted scoring model? Is it based on an ROI, return on investment? Is it total cost of ownership? What is it? And I think asking them very early in the process will help guide you on which approach from a value messaging you want to use. So as an example, if I had a customer tell me, if I had a prospect tell me they're going to be making a decision based on total cost of ownership, I may take a very different approach than if they told me it's going to be on some kind of weighted scoring model. You also obviously want to understand who's involved in the buying process and what influence do they have and all that stuff. But that's kind of how I would customize it as I go.
Absolutely, yeah, we couldn't agree more. And actually the free white paper that you all get with completing the survey at the end of today's webinar gets into some of those gory details written by our CEO. So that's a great piece as well to kind of dive deeper into this question. Okay, next one for you, Chris. So we sell to a variety of buyers, from small businesses to large corporations with different buying processes. How can we assure that our sales reps are prepared for all of them?
Yeah, that's another good question. It is likely that as you get to larger organizations, your larger customer organizations, they'll probably be more formal and probably more sophisticated than smaller organizations. So you might want to spend some time, if you haven't done it already, and build kind of some prototypes or just some kind of mock-ups of different segments and how they behave, and keep it simple. But if you had a general segment view of large customers and how they buy, I might engage them differently than the segment of smaller customers and how they buy. And I might make my tools less sophisticated for the smaller customers. Obviously, with larger customers, often the sales process is much longer because you have lots of different people involved and they have some formality in their process. So I would just try to get some segmentation and customize my approach a little bit by segment.
Yep, great. And the last one for you, Chris. How do we assure that our sales reps are communicating value early when they're so customized to kind of their features and benefits presentation?
Yeah, so part of this is, and this is a dilemma often in sales and marketing, is I've been involved where marketing says sales can't sell on value, and then you talk to the sales team and they said, love to sell on value, but I have no tools. So it's obviously this chicken and the egg that sometimes occurs. And what I've found is you need to be able to educate the sales team on, if they're not there already asking for tools, why do they need to move beyond features and benefits to value, and what it actually means to them personally. And obviously with something like this, you could do a simple pilot, pick a key product you have and some willing participants, and do some value-based pilots and see what happens to your close rate and your sales in those territories or those situations. Those are nice ways to just educate the sales team. In my experience dealing with lots of companies, you usually have, if you're dealing with a large enough sales organization, whether you have tools or not formally out of marketing, the sales team, usually there's a subsegment of 10% or so of them who are very clever people who have developed their own selling tools and are using them with some degree of success. So part of what you could also do is survey your sales team and find out, are there people out there in the sales team? And there usually is. Some segment who have developed their own tools and are using them successfully. And then the question is, how do you get the rest of the group to kind of A, buy into that, and B, get them to the skill level where they can use those effectively. And there's some effort in doing that. That doesn't happen by magic. But usually those are a couple of approaches that work well.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Okay, great. So that is actually all the questions we have for today. If you guys have any more questions that you want answered, just shoot them over to either of these email addresses on the screen. But before you go, reminder to register for next month's webinar during the exit survey. Peyton Marshall is back discussing account-based selling for buyer enablement. How does your solution address specific customer problems? So thank you all for taking the time to join us, and a special thank you to Chris for your insights. From all of us here at Leverage Point, hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.